Hello and welcome to another episode of All Politics is Local. I'm your host, John Tian. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. I've got yet another great show planned for you tonight. With me in the studio is my good friend, Jim Miller, managing editor of The Interpreter magazine, contributing writer at Reuters, and a host of other titles. Jim, welcome to All Politics is Local. Welcome back, I should say.
Thanks for having me as always, John.
Thank you for being here, and let's just dive right in. All politics being local, we're going to talk about the world. So it's kind of our location in the solar system right now. Let's dive right in with some big news going on in the Middle East. Turkey, a couple of days ago, invaded Syria, and it's something that the press in the United States doesn't seem to be paying an awful lot of attention to.
No. So what's happened in Syria is that, yes, things are complicated. And I think that the American people, and I don't think they're at fault, but I think the politicians and the media equate complicated with unknowable. And that's just not true. It's not true in physics, it's not true in medicine, and it's not true in politics. And so no one quite understands or wants to really get into this depth of the crisis. At least lots of people do, but they're sort of in these foreign policy think tanks and these sort of really heady organizations that I write for, frankly, and and that's not making it to the TV, and it's not making it to our political conversations.
Right.
And because of that, we have this sort of very crucially important story, being Syria, and it's important for many, many, many different reasons. We're just not talking about it. Or we talk about it very generally, or we talk about some of the smallest pieces of it. So, for instance, everybody talks about ISIS, Islamic State. I would say if you watch the TV and they talk about Syria, they're going to talk about ISIS. Russia has only been involved in bombing Syria for the last year, for actually 11 months.
Right. Now, they've been bombing not only ISIS targets, though, they've also been bombing targets of the opposition to Bashar al-Assad, right?
Well, so what's interesting is that mostly they've actually very few of their bombs have actually hit ISIS targets. Okay. Most of their bombs have hit civilians.
Okay.
And on purpose.
On purpose.
By accident, on purpose. The civilians are the target. The moderate rebels that we have supported, there are not moderate rebels too, but the moderate rebels that we have supported, the U.S. has supported Turkey, the CIA, the Pentagon, France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, those are the ones that Russia's bombing. Russia, in 11 months, has killed more civilians than ISIS has. ISIS has been around since 2014. So ISIS is actually a relatively, I don't want to say minor player, but they are less than half of the Syrian story.
Right.
The Syria crisis starts in 2011. ISIS shows up in 2014. So the major piece of the story is being ignored in this country. It is not being ignored in Europe, and it's certainly not being ignored in the Middle East. So in this complicated mess that we have Turkey. And Turkey, major NATO ally. So a refresher, the key piece of the NATO alliance is that an attack on, it's Article 4, the attack on any NATO ally is an attack on
NATO.
NATO is attack on all nations, and we are supposed to intervene. Now, one step below that is NATO countries have the ability to call an emergency meeting of NATO countries. So if they're not quite ready to say we're being attacked, they can call this emergency meeting. And this clause has only been invoked 5 times since the NATO treaty was formed. NATO treaty was formed right after World War II.
Right after World War II, exactly, yep.
All of those times have been since 2003. And 4 of those invocations have been from Turkey.
Okay.
The first invocation was in 2003. Turkey was concerned that if we were going to invade Iraq, that Saddam Hussein would retaliate against Turkey. So Turkey wanted guarantees for their own security.
Right. They wanted assurances from NATO that the Article 4 would be honored, et cetera. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other three have all been in since 2012. And this is Turkey basically screaming from the rafters that they are an existential threat because of the crisis in Syria. And not because of ISIS, but because of the war that is being waged by Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president.
Right, and essentially what Assad has done is he's kind of freed up the Kurds in the northern part of Syria, and that's where Turkey's intervention is coming from, isn't it? Aren't they attacking the Kurds?
Yes, so maybe we can call up, I don't know what your file name is.
Brett, I believe the image that we're going to be looking for here is Turkey map. If you could bring that up. Yeah, so we can take a look at that. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can't, actually call up the other one first.
Okay, so can we pull up territory 2013 to 2016, please?
Okay, so let me explain what's happening. So this is the north of Syria. And between 2012 and 2013, moderate rebels this is the top piece of that image, moderate rebels there in sort of the darker green have taken over a tremendous amount of territory. You see a little sliver of red maybe over on the left and a couple little patches. Those are territory held by the Assad regime. The moderate rebels have taken over the rest. And these are led by the Free Syrian Army, which is the group that we back. They're the group Turkey backs. And by the way, the Free Syrian Army is made up of a coalition of lots of different groups of people. In fact, for a large part of this period of time, the Syrian government in exile was actually led by a Kurd.
Okay.
So that's interesting. Now, the light green areas are Kurdish areas.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And so there was this hope back then that what would happen is that Syria after Assad would become this coalition of Kurds and Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs and Alawites and other minority groups, Christians. There were Christians in the leadership, and that they would take over.
Right.
So if you go back to that graphic,
Right, it's right here. Yeah.
what you see is by 2014, all of that black grayish stuff, that's ISIS.
Okay.
ISIS comes in and they literally are at war or they push out the moderate rebels. And the moderate rebels are now hiding in a relatively small amount of space.
Right.
Now, what the United States does during this period is they start to arm and back with intelligence and back with airstrikes the Kurds. So between 2015 and 2016, you have that Kurdish area, this is the bottom graphic, expand massively.
Right.
Well, ISIS has also expanded to the west. So you have that small sliver of dark green that used to control the majority of the country is now being attacked. They're being attacked by Kurds. They're being attacked by ISIS.
And they're being attacked by Assad.
And they're being attacked by Assad. And starting in September of 2015, they're being attacked by Russian airstrikes. And also starting in this period of time, they're being attacked by Hezbollah, which is another major terrorist group, Israel's enemy number one.
Arch enemy, yep.
Hezbollah. Hezbollah came in to fight from Lebanon on behalf of the Syrian government. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps essentially has run Assad's war. But then they were bringing in troops during 2014, 2015, 2016.
Okay.
And Shia militias from Iraq. So you remember the Al-Sadr Brigade, all these guys who killed all these American soldiers.
Right.
Well, they were now fighting our proxies in Syria. And we, by the way, were more or less sort of wavering. Should we arm them? Should we not? We gave them some weapons, then we stopped. And it was this sort of chess game that we were playing to get them just strong enough so that everybody would negotiate. And except that never happened.
Yep.
What happened was that Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and Assad were backing the Assad regime far more than we were backing any of these moderate rebels.
End of the opposition, yeah. Yep.
ISIS took over. And then the Kurds were taking over all these positions. Now, during this period of time, in the last year,
The
Turkey
graphic is back up. if you
has
did.
gone from a very safe place. Just a year, maybe a year and a half ago, I was telling people, travel anywhere is dangerous, but travel in Turkey is relatively very safe, especially in the major cities, in Istanbul and these types of places. And now it's not.
Now it's not. A couple of weeks ago, we had a coup.
We had a coup.
Yep.
And so what happened? Well, what happened, I believe, and I should say it's very hard to tell what's happening in Turkey because one of the things that's happening is the free press is being attacked. There have been foreign journalists who have been assassinated by ISIS. There are fewer Western news agencies that are operating with freedom. Everyone is afraid to talk to the press, and then the Turkish government is arresting people. But here's what we are piecing together, is that, Turkey was a modern military, a NATO member, one of our sort of the front lines in the Cold War, the front lines on the war on terror. We had very good relationship with Turkey. They were a moderate Muslim state, very secular state, really. And the Turkish president is changing all of that.
Now that's Erdogan, right?
That's Erdogan.
And how long has he been in power? I can't remember when he came to power. He wasn't in power in 2003, am I correct?
I think he was.
He may have been?
I'll be
Okay.
honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
But, off the top of my head.
Sorry to put you on the spot
on
there,
a Monday,
Jim.
but that's, but certainly it's really only over the last, say, 6 to 8 years, you start to see Turkey really assert itself as a regional player and move more towards Islamic law, but also these sort of divisions between the military that is there. These are guys who were used to being parts of NATO, working within the NATO structure where the White House calls the shots in NATO.
Right.
And what was happening was the Turkish government wanted to intervene in Syria, and the White House was saying, no, we don't want Turkey to get involved in Syria. We don't want Turkish tanks. This could get into a whole conflict with Russia and Assad, and we don't want to back an invasion. We want to do this by proxy. And then the coup happens. And, well, one of the things that Turkey has done is they've eliminated all of these generals, these top-ranking generals who were very much in that sort of mindset, well, we have to listen to the United States. And now Turkey's saying, no, we don't have to listen to the United States.
Right.
So if you bring up the other Syria graphic.
Can we have the other graphic now, Brett? There we go, right there.
Okay, so this one, if you can see, the area in sort of where all that activity, this is a website, it's fantastic, it's called Live UA Map, and you can view conflicts in various countries, and this is Syria. So in that sort of top center area where all that activity is, that is where Turkey invaded. And here you have the yellow is Kurdish areas, and the black is ISIS.
And then we have the red is Assad.
The red is Assad, and the green is
the Syrian opposition
the Free
forces.
Syrian Army.
Okay.
And so Turkey invaded ISIS territory, but they invaded ISIS territory that was right next to the Kurds.
Right.
So what was happening was the Kurds were advancing and advancing and advancing, and the rebels are engaged with this major fight for Aleppo city, which is there in the bottom where that red is, okay?
Yep.
Major fight. Just a month ago, Aleppo city was completely surrounded by the Assad regime, and everybody thought that this was toast. This was effectively one of the biggest defeats that the rebels have ever suffered. That was going to happen. And lo and behold, the coup happens. All these weapons start showing up. The rebels are all of a sudden very well coordinated. Well, what we know is that Turkey has stepped in, and they've backed all these rebels. And they broke the siege of Aleppo. But during this period of time, the Kurds were increasingly gaining territory against ISIS.
Okay.
And so Turkey finally said, no more.
No more.
We are invading with not our proxies, but with our proxies and with tanks.
And with our tanks.
Troops
Yep.
and special forces
Yep.
and U.S. airstrikes. And they invaded this territory right there between the Kurdish area and ISIS.
Okay.
And they dealt ISIS a big defeat. As a matter of fact, ISIS withdrew. So now Turkey wants to advance west towards where that green is, and they want to link up with their rebels.
Okay.
But right now they're actually fighting, mainly artillery duels, with the Kurdish groups. These are groups that we have been backing for years. So groups that we've been backing for years are fighting our NATO ally. And we're stuck because, frankly, we have refused to lead in this area. And we've refused to lead for a lot of reasons. You know, Syria is a perfect example where the left and the right and the center and everybody has got it wrong. And of course, there's a lot of reasons for this. You know, you have the big elephant in the room is Iraq. You know, the 2003 Iraq invasion.
Can we take this graphic down? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Brad.
The 2003 Iraq invasion, everybody's sick of war, and also everybody sort of views all of these conflicts in the Middle East as sort of all part of the same thing. And in fact, they're all very different dynamics, but there's one constant. And that one constant is wherever there is chaos, there is terrorism. And wherever we let that chaos get out of control, there are actually terrorists controlling physical property, as opposed to just fighting in the shadows. And that's where ISIS came in, and that's where Al-Qaeda has come in. And that's where the Iraq state is falling apart, and Libya, and all the rest.
There's one that we can't even get to today is the war in Qatar. Huge. Saudi Arabia is in
Yemen.
Oh, in Yemen.
Yep.
Okay, I thought they were in Qatar.
Yep.
No, they're in Yemen. Okay, there's a lot of bombing going on there as well, right?
Yeah, and so this is all also, there's all these countries that are sort of playing this proxy war. So Iran has soldiers in Iraq. Oh, they don't say that, but they are. And Syria, they admit, and Yemen, they have more proxies in Yemen.
Okay.
And Saudi Arabia had proxies in Yemen, and they have proxies in Syria, and so there's this regional conflict being played out. And sort of the further along we get, the more complicated it gets. But, you know, and this is where, again, I think neither the Hawks nor the Doves have got it right. You know, the Barack Obama's administration has been very hesitant to get involved in sort of direct intervention, even in Libya, where it was our strongest intervention. France led the way. You know, even there, and this is actually a major point of contention between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton wanted to get involved in that. She wanted to get involved in it first.
She wanted to be more hands-on and more,
She wanted to take the lead, but she also wanted to make sure that things didn't fall apart when it was over. And when that conflict was over, we were very much hands-off. And I think we're seeing that consequence now. But Yemen is almost the mirror image. We have disappointed in many ways our Saudi ally. And so we have allowed Saudi Arabia to do, frankly, many of the things that Bashar al-Assad is doing in Syria, but in Yemen. So hospitals have been struck. A humanitarian crisis is growing. And we've sort of supported that, not to the level that Russia has worked in Syria, but that was sort of the trade-off. Well, we can't alienate all our enemies, so we sort of have, or all our allies, so we have to let them do what we want them, whatever they want to do in a place like Yemen, which is less important to us than a place like Syria.
Right.
So
let's end our discussion of Syria with one last graphic, and that is that little boy Amran. Brad, if you have, here it is right here. 5-year-old boy. He was pulled from a building that had been bombed during an airstrike. It was undetermined who actually performed the airstrike.
Well, it was and it was not. The only people conducting airstrikes in this area are Russia and Syria, and they're on the same side. So does it really matter?
Right.
So look, you know. Every single day, the day that this young man died, and I wrote a piece for the Daily Beast that sort of spells this out. The day that this young man, or he didn't die, he survived.
Right, but when he was injured, yeah.
But that day, 83 people were killed in that country by Russian and Syrian bombs, primarily. I think 38 died in Aleppo, which is where this young child was. and I think 23 of them were children.
And they've also been targeting doctors in Aleppo.
Russia has destroyed all of the major hospitals, and now what you have is you have these sort of hidden hospitals, more like clinics, operating in often buildings that are also partially destroyed. So they rescued this child. There just happened to be activists that took picture and video, and his story goes wild. But one of the things that amazes me is that in so many articles, so he was front page news on all these newspapers, but in so many of them, first of all, they all mention ISIS. ISIS is nowhere near Aleppo. So the closest ISIS position is probably 40 kilometers from where this happened. The regime and Kurdish groups and moderate rebel groups, all of which are at war with ISIS, are between ISIS and this child's
and this particular
home.
incident.
Yeah. But also, this child's home was also several kilometers behind the front lines of fighting. So what happens is that Russia and Assad have always punished the civilians for military defeats that they've suffered. Russia benefits from this refugee crisis because where did the refugees go? Well, they go to our allies. They go to Jordan.
Right.
They go to, in the case of Aleppo, they go to Turkey, and then they go on to Europe. There's been a huge backlash in Europe against minorities, against migrants,
Against
immigrants,
refugees.
refugees. Okay, those parties are all right-wing, ultra-nationalist. Many of them have neo-Nazi elements. Many of them are almost openly neo-Nazi. Okay, Russia has close ties to many of those parties, supports the same rhetoric. So Russia is bombing Syria, driving the immigrants to Europe, and then supporting anti-immigrant parties in Europe.
Yeah, creating discord and just
That's right. And so that's where Brexit is. Russia was almost openly rooting for Brexit. That is where Putin is playing the world.
He is.
And we're letting it happen. And now we're seeing it. We are finally awakening to it in this country.
Yeah.
Because he's also playing us.
He's playing us for fools. Let's move on to another map. I believe we have one of the Ukraine. Do I have a Ukraine map in there? I do not, but I do have some images from the Ukraine. Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, was famously supporting Yanukovych, in Ukraine. He was president of the country for a couple of years, got himself elected with Paul Manafort's help. Manafort apparently took some bribe money from him at one point or another. There was a handwritten ledger. Brett, could you bring up the ledger? Here's the ledger. It's a little indistinct and probably hard to read on the TV set, but this is in the New York Times, and it details payments of $12.7 million to Paul Manafort.
Yeah, that's right. So the sort of the history here is a guy by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. He runs this thing called the Party of Regions, and he becomes prime minister in Ukraine. And he is ousted by basically a political uprising of people who were Ukrainians who were sick of poverty and government corruption. And so they hold this political uprising. It's called the Orange Revolution, and peaceful, although the protesters were often attacked. So he gets kicked out, and he loses power. And during this period of time, unfortunately, the person who replaces him is not much better. And through Paul Manafort's help, Viktor Yanukovych becomes president again. And during this period of time, you see a real entrenchment in this sort of kleptocracy. Kleptocracy literally meaning kleptomaniac, right? People are
stealing.
Politicians stealing money and giving it to their friends. So this looks a lot like, most of the buildings in Ukraine. I go to Ukraine at least once a year. I'm going to be there in a couple of weeks. Most of the buildings are owned by about 1 of 10 people. And then many of them the businesses that operate in that building might be owned by one of the different oligarchs.
Okay.
And so they might cut a deal, say, I want to buy this piece of property, and they say, well, okay, well, you have to open one of your restaurants in my building that I have open. And so the money keeps trading hands, and the government is very much involved in this. And this is what the current government is trying to fight. They're trying to break apart this system.
Oligarchy. Yeah.
And and it all goes back to the Soviet Union. When Ukraine being part of the Soviet Union, they were a communist country, and the state owned everything.
Right.
And what happened in Russia and in all these other places is that at the end of that process, you needed a mechanism for private ownership to take place. And in many countries, what happened was that the friends of the government, they're the ones who got the property.
Yep.
And so they now had the political power, they had the economic power. What's actually interesting is that Putin, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, he worked in an office in St. Petersburg where he got to decide who got what at the end of this process.
So that's where he's able to pull favors in.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So Putin goes from nobody to president in a very short amount of period of time, because all of the people with the money and the political favors knew who he was, because he had hooked them up. It's almost like a mafia state. You watch out for me, I'll watch out for you, and nobody dies.
Right. Right.
And Ukraine is very much like that. So Paul Manafort is operating. He's getting paid by the Party of Regions and by Viktor Yanukovych under the table. That's why that
handwritten ledger is so important. Yep.
So what's interesting is that we being the Western press, started to publish articles about Paul Manafort's connections to Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine didn't know who he was.
because he was that shadowy.
Right,
Yeah.
because when they took over, when Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in the newest Euromaidan revolution in 2014, he fled the country. And
he's now in Moscow, right?
He's in a place called Rostov-on-Don, which is almost maybe not quite the Miami Beach of Russia, but it's nice.
It sounds like a nice place.
It's a nice little rested place, yeah. On a lake. It's in southern Russia, so the weather's nice.
Yep.
Russia is huge.
Yep.
It's not all Siberia.
It's not all Siberia.
Not even half. It's amazing how big it is. Biggest country in the world. But so basically people woke up one morning in the middle of this political turmoil to find that the government was literally gone. It had just disappeared overnight. It had fled to Russia. And the doors to the government, some government agencies, and the presidential palace were literally unlocked. And huge amounts of documents had been dumped in rivers and bodies of water because they didn't even have time to burn them.
Okay.
And literally.
So that's where this ledger came from?
So this ledger was one of many, many, many documents that was recovered from, I think, from the presidential mansion, but I'd have to look. And so it's handwritten, it's not computerized. And but as it turns out, the Ukrainian government had some knowledge that Paul Manafort had been receiving off-the-record payments recorded in literally handwritten notebooks.
We could call it ill-gotten gains.
Ill-gotten gains. And so we don't really know what that was for, but we know a lot about his political activity. And so what we find is that Paul Manafort was working for this Party of Regions and Viktor Yanukovych before, during, and after the Euromaidan protests. So the Euromaidan protests were basically people wanted to join the European Union in 2013 because as part of the European Union, you have to meet like our OSHA guidelines.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yep.
But you also have to pay taxes and have financial transparency and
you can't have transparency when you're looting the treasury.
That's correct.
So, yeah.
So the people wanted these things because it would effectively put an end to this system of corruption.
Right. I would call it an oligarchic kleptocracy.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair description?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect. And the government didn't. But Yanukovych, he sort of wavered. He led the people to believe that he did, and then he didn't. And so this culminates in February 2014, where Yanukovych literally has his snipers murder like 100 people. Now, Paul Manafort was working for Yanukovych at every step of this process. And after Yanukovych fled, his political party didn't go away. And Paul Manafort continues to work for the Party of Regions.
Wow.
But they rebrand themselves, same people, same policies, pro-Russian, pro-oligarchy. They rebrand themselves as the opposition bloc, which I suppose is fair, being is that now they've lost the country, and so they're the opposition
Sure, they're the
bloc.
opposition bloc, yeah.
But this is even after this party has murdered, hundreds of people and stolen God knows how much money.
Well, let's look at some of the things that were discovered when they found that the doors of the presidential palace were thrown open.
Yeah, so I was covering these
Brett.
protests live.
Brett, let's bring up the garage photo.
I was covering these protests live every single day, and they kept getting bloodier and bloodier. And finally, basically, the opposition politicians cut a deal with Viktor Yanukovych, and they were booed off the stage. Basically, too many people. The deal wasn't good enough. Too many people had died. This government needed to go.
Yep.
And that night, they vowed to march on the presidential palace. And well, when they got there the next morning, they found it gone. And CCTV shows the president getting on a private plane.
Yeah.
And what people find is amazing.
This is this kind of stuff that he couldn't take with him.
This is I've seen the whole thing. This is a very tiny portion of this man's garage. This is on the presidential palace. Now, I should say, there was no formal there's no budget, official budget that bought all these things.
Right.
And Viktor Yanukovych's reported income was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet they found dozens of antique motorcycles, and automobiles, and incredible wealth.
Let's pull up the golden loaf, Brett. This is really stunning. This is a golden loaf of bread.
It is this massive, solid gold loaf of bread, which is amazing, being is that Ukrainians were having problems feeding themselves.
Sure.
And their president has this golden loaf.
It just brings a whole new meaning to let them eat cake.
Oh, it's amazing. And my favorite part of this story is that in all of the subway stations in Ukraine that I've been to, there are merchants that are selling magnets of the golden loaf of bread. So you can, I have one
you can
on
get one
my
and put it
dad's
on your
fridge.
You can put it on your fridge.
There you go.
Let's take a look at one more, Brett, the pirate ship. This, I suppose there is no better symbol for I am looting the treasury than a pirate ship.
Amazing. So in his backyard, this massive complex, which was surrounded by high walls and trees, Ukrainians were living right next to this, had no idea. There was an exotic animal petting zoo, and there was a small man-made pond with a pirate ship. A galleon, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, a pirate ship.
Inside was this ornate dining room, and so he was having guests on this elaborate ship. It didn't go anywhere.
Lavish parties
Yeah.
on the pirate ship.
Yeah, and the Ukrainian people, they bought it.
They bought it.
Had no idea.
I suppose they could turn it all into a museum of opulence or something to remind the country that.
Yeah, so that's actually, you can, and I think I should find out. Maybe I'll pay it a visit. But there was talk about actually making it a museum.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But for a long time, in this sort of quasi, I don't want to say lawless, because that's not true. But there was this weird period of time where there's no government in Ukraine.
Okay.
It was a few days, and people were just sort of wandering around the city in Kiev, opening doors and finding all this opulent wealth that they had paid for.
That they had paid for.
And they didn't
Brett,
know.
we're done with the graphic, I guess. So yeah.
But this is the sort of system, and when you look at, and by the way, Paul Manafort might be the most famous Trump campaigner.
Oh, but there are plenty of others.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're still with him.
Carter Page. Is it Carter,
Carter
Page?
Page,
Carter
yep,
Page.
yep.
You know, was also, I believe, he was on Putin's payroll at one point in time.
And he's still with the Trump campaign.
He's still with the Trump
campaign. He
campaign.
hasn't resigned or been fired. Yeah.
And one of Trump's national security advisors, whose name escapes me, Lieutenant Colonel something or other. He amazing. There was an award ceremony for RT, the Russian propaganda. It was Russia Today is what it used to stand for, and it's a propaganda outlet. I mean, of sort of the worst possible kind. And there was an awards ceremony for this, and this Trump advisor was videoed sitting next to Putin at the awards ceremony for this propaganda outlet.
Wow.
Just sort of, I mean, you cannot wash your hands enough. Now, so people might ask, is it an accident? Is it just not vetting properly? And I would say no. You know, Donald Trump, the way he conducts his business affairs, and the way his staffers conduct their business affairs, frankly, they're just American Yanukovyches. You know, they have buddies all over the world. And, you know, I actually saw Trump speak via satellite in Ukraine a year ago at this conference that I'm going to in a few weeks. And, you know, some of the wealthier guys, oh, yeah, our old friend Donald. Because, you know, they've all cut deals with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And, you know, if Donald Trump hasn't cut a deal directly, you know, his friends have. And so there's this sort of system where everybody's cutting deals with everybody else, and everybody's speaking well on everybody else's behalf, and everybody's lobbying for everybody else. Whether they're directly involved or not, they're all part of this cycle where a relatively few amount of people are making business deals amongst each other. They're enriching each other.
Yep.
And that's where we are.
And it really leaves me no guess as to the nature of a potential Donald Trump presidency and what it would be like for the taxpayers in this country.
Well, so this kind of stuff with the Manafort and the whatever. This was the buzz before I went on vacation, and I swore that I wouldn't write about Trump. And when I was on vacation, I'm not going to write about Trump when I get back. And I came back to find that in the course of a few days, he and his allies had gone on talk shows and raised the possibility of dropping sanctions against Russia, of doing business with Russia. They were critical of NATO.
Critical of NATO, may not support NATO allies.
May not support NATO allies that were legally obligated to support. And then the kicker comes, where the information begins to come out that the Democratic National Committee has been hacked, and they've been hacked by Russian hackers. Not just Russian hackers, as in hackers from Russia, but by the Russian government.
Yes,
by
state actors.
Right, by the GRU, which is their military intelligence apparatus, and by the FSB, which is the former KGB, which, by the way, Putin used to run. So there we go. And they were looking for information first about Donald Trump, but I think that was just a cover, because then what we find is that they were digging up dirt on Hillary Clinton, and they were seeking to publicly embarrass Hillary Clinton. Now, people looked at the technical aspects of this and said that, oh, yes, the Russian government fingerprints are all over this. And all this information is then, the information that was received from this hack begins to be published through WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks says, no. This information came from this Romanian hacker. It's just one man, and he did the hacking. So intrepid journalists
had an interview with him.
Yeah. So they contacted him. They said, okay, Mr. Hacker, will you talk to the media? He says, absolutely. He says, are you one man? Absolutely. Where are you from? I'm from Romania. Great. Let me ask you some questions in Romanian. and his answers were incoherent Romanian.
Right.
As it turns out, he can't speak Romanian. So they say, well, okay, can you speak Russian? And he says, no, I speak English. So they ask him questions in English, and the response is totally jarbled. It's again almost incoherent. The journalist, and this is going back and forth email, the journalists complain that, look, what language do you speak? Because it's clearly not English.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the responses are in English,
There you
and
go.
they're
In
very
perfect
well
English,
written,
yes,
perfect
yes,
English.
yeah.
Okay. So you can almost see, you know,
This is not one person I'm talking to here. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And this is exactly what we would expect if this was a cover. So you have WikiLeaks deliberately publishing information that was received by Russian government a cyber attack, published directly with the intention of discrediting the Democratic Party.
Right. And then you have Trump a couple of days later asking Russia to go hack Hillary's email, find those 30,000 emails.
That's correct.
Just truly, just an unreal moment.
Right.
They call presidential election years the silly season. This has been the silliest of them all.
And you know, if you compare Donald Trump to, say, George W. Bush, okay, and look, there was a lot of criticism of George Bush, and I partook you might remember the Swift Boats Veterans for Change.
Right.
This
for,
is where
for truth.
For truth, right. Yeah. And, you know, where they were criticizing John Kerry's war record.
Right.
And some people might say, myself included, might say George Bush didn't speak out strongly enough against those people. But in fact, he did speak out against those people. He said, no, look, John Kerry's a war hero. We know he's a war hero. This is you know, this is beyond the pale. This is not the kind of thing that we want in our politics. And you know, similar things have happened with John McCain, and you know, our politicians have always risen to that, even when they're playing dirty, sort of.
Right.
They've
Well,
always risen to a certain level.
There was that famous moment in the 2008 campaign where a woman took the microphone from McCain and said that she doesn't trust Obama because he's an Arab,
Right.
and all. You know, she started to go down that path. And McCain took the microphone back from her. And even though the crowd didn't like what he did,
That's right.
he said, no, ma'am, no, I'm sorry. He's a decent, hardworking American.
Yeah.
He and I have differences of opinion.
Yeah.
And to his great credit, he tried to tamp down the incredible buildup that was happening with all the, you know, those kind of attitudes.
Yeah, that's right. After 9/11, you know, I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. for 9/11. It was terrifying. And, you know, right after that, we had the anthrax attack, which everybody forgets about.
Yeah, everybody forgets about.
But that
Yep.
shut down my mailroom and on my campus, and members of the campus staff were isolated because they might have had anthrax.
Yeah.
It was really terrifying. And then we had the D.C. sniper. There were all these terrible things. And George Bush had an opportunity there to do some real damage, and he didn't.
Yep.
You know, he spoke out and he said, you know, this is not about Islam. It's not about Muslim Americans. A lot of Muslim Americans died that day. A lot
Right.
of Muslim Americans serve our country.
Right. There was a makeshift mosque in one of the stairwells that was destroyed, and several Muslims went there because they knew they were trapped. And that's where they died.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, and by the way, if you see, now there was an increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes after 9/11, but it was not anywhere near to the degree that you would expect being at the scale of attack. And then hate crimes against Muslims more or less stayed constant until
Donald Trump.
July 2015. Massive spike. And it did not correspond to a particular terrorist attack.
Yep.
It corresponded to Donald Trump. So you have a guy who is worshiping at the trough of the most terrible things in our politics, as opposed to moving the other way. Now, do I think Donald Trump is actually working for the Russian government? No. I actually think they're just both playing for the same side.
Right. And he's a tool at this point. He's an unwitting tool of the Russian government at this point, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, Donald Trump has said things like, well, we'll just let Russia bomb ISIS in Syria, and we won't pay any attention. Well, again, military analysts analyze every single Russian airstrike. You can literally look them up on a map, and almost none of them target ISIS.
Right.
So Donald Trump's, let's just let them target ISIS. Well, Russia's not targeting ISIS.
Right. They're going to target Assad's opposition because they've always been a friend to the Assad regime.
Yeah.
Back when it was Bashar's father, Hafez, Russia was there. Russia was their friend.
And there are elements in Europe, and they're interesting. See, a lot of American businessmen and a lot of, the American economy, I looked at it a lot in relation to events in Ukraine. And shrug. There's not a lot of American trade with Ukraine. There's not a lot of American trade with Russia, frankly. They're not a major manufacturer. They're not a major buyer of American goods. There are certain industries, energy industries, but there's also real estate and people who make yachts. This is where the Russians and Americans do business. Very few of them. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that so many of Trump's staffers are people who do business with Russia and Ukraine. And, there are elements in Europe that did not want sanctions against Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia first invaded Crimea. Mm-hmm. They took it over by force.
Well, wait a minute, but Trump would tell you that Russia's not in Ukraine.
He would. Yeah.
Famously.
And then, I myself have published a report that's in the Library of Congress. You can look it up. That documents Russian military troop presence in eastern Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So it's not just Crimea. And the sanctions were put in place, but there have always been elements in Europe. They don't want sanctions. Sanctions are bad for business.
Right.
They want to do business. Mm-hmm. So they're the opposite. And so it's interesting to me that, you had all of these things happen all at once. You have Donald Trump praise Russian hackers. You have Donald Trump's staff being investigated for, potential crimes in Ukraine. And you have Donald Trump himself say, oh, let Russia do whatever Russia wants to do in Syria. Oh, and we should maybe drop sanctions over Ukraine.
Wow. So let's move on to where Donald Trump is today. Now he's got Steve Bannon of Breitbart News as his campaign CEO, which I didn't know campaigns had a CEO. That was really kind of stunning to me to find that a campaign could have a CEO. And then his campaign manager is Kellyanne Conway. She's no stranger to punditry, but she's never been tremendously right about what she's saying on TV. She's a pollster, and her more or less her claim to fame is that she's kind of like often wrong. She doesn't get it right very often. And now she's saying, well, the polls are skewed because it's a reverse Bradley effect in that there's a lot of people out there who are going to vote for Trump, but they don't want to admit that to another person because it's not fashionable to admit that. So
and Trump's entire campaign, and I want to talk about Breitbart, so remind me, we'll get back there. But Trump's entire campaign, I've criticized Republicans, perhaps in general, for their not being particularly interested in the facts on certain issues, but they're always a little interested in the facts. It's never like, or very rarely is it pure fiction. Mm-hmm. And with Trump, it literally doesn't matter. Right. It's the facts do not matter. Yeah. What Donald Trump said on day A is going to be different than day B. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. His son was on TV the other day saying that Donald Trump is running for president because of several different internet conspiracies that don't actually exist. Mm-hmm. He listed a bunch of them. One of them was our firefighters can't fly the American flag from the back of their trucks. Yeah. This happened in Coventry, Rhode Island, right down the road. And it wasn't true. It wasn't the case. The firemen had put some flags on the back of the truck, but some residents raised the safety issue of, this flag is tattered. It may tear off the truck and land on a car behind it. And, so they raised a safety issue. They didn't so much say, you can't do that. but they raised valid issues about whether or not this should be done.
What we have is we have the memification of American politics. The internet meme that you see on Facebook, you see it on Twitter, it's literally nothing more than a propaganda poster for the 21st century.
Yeah.
We had gotten rid of that.
Yeah.
The world had moved beyond propaganda posters.
Right.
And in the last, say, 8 years, they're back with a vengeance.
With a vengeance. They're online. They're in social media.
Defining our politics. And here's what's happening in here, is that I actually believe that the best way to get a good government is to have 2 or more honest brokers.
Right.
Even if they disagree on policy or ideology.
They could massively disagree as long as it's somewhat related to the truth.
Yep. Because when that dialogue happens, one of them is going to win, the other one is going to lose, but somebody's going to control Congress, the other person's going to control the White House. You can start to see that middle ground evolve. And you see that a lot in local politics, maybe to a lesser degree recently. You certainly see it, you still see it at the state house. I think Massachusetts has had a very healthy state house since the early 2000s, maybe the healthiest state house in the Union. And you've seen that sort of where it's not about Republican or Democrat, it's about hashing out the facts, the fiscal policy. Let's figure out what we can do and how we can afford it. And those conversations aren't happening. Simply speaking, it's like a kindergarten. Yeah. There's no facts at play here, I mean, how can you hammer out a Syria policy when you have or a policy about anything when it's just all memes?
Yeah.
And and that's very dangerous.
Well, you have James Inhofe bringing a snowball into the halls of the Senate to say, look, there's no climate change. I have a snowball.
Yeah. When the oil companies admit that there's climate change,
right?
And
when they knew about climate change years and years and years ago, and actually made plans for their oil rigs.
Sure.
To deal with sea level rise due to climate change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We only have about 5 minutes left, so let's get into Breitbart. You wanted to discuss them.
Yeah, so Breitbart is fascinating. And Breitbart is just one of the bigger, sort of right-wing, really aggressively right-wing political news. But the thing with Breitbart is that unlike sort of the Drudge Report, Drudge Report is just sort of this collage of different sources. Breitbart is almost a think tank in the sense that they've always been much more highly coordinated efforts. I began to see a shift in Breitbart about a year ago, where you started to see them move and sort of sugarcoat European fascism, frankly. Really racist stuff, anti-Muslim, anti-African, and surprisingly anti-Jewish.
Right.
Which anti-Semitism is a thing that I've really not encountered in my life.
Yeah.
And I was shocked to see Breitbart sugarcoat more and more of this stuff. And a theory has emerged that I am, subscribed to, that this was an effort to move the Republican base, the conservative base, I should say, towards the racist. And so that when Donald Trump came to power on the right, that would be mainstream conservatism. And one of the examples that I have, I don't know if you have the graphic that I sent you.
No, I don't think I do.
It's okay. So in Poland, in Austria.
I remember that. Yeah, I didn't put that one in. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So in Austria, there was an election, and the right-wing neo-Nazi party. So literally, one of the candidates was running as a member of a political party that used to be the Nazi Party. Literally, okay? It evolved, changed its name, and now modern day. Okay, so he loses this election. RT famously tweets out that he won the election, and it was a complete embarrassment to the idea of the European Union. So that was wrong. But Breitbart tweets out this tweet that a leftist, communist, socialist, insert derogatory term, defeats a centrist anti-immigration.
I think it said snatches victory or
something like
steals
that.
victory or something. Yeah, it was ludicrous.
Yeah, when in reality what had happened was a maybe left of center rational candidate had won an election legitimately against
a member of the alt-right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And these are the people who are now running the Trump campaign.
Right. Well, Bannon apparently is guilty of voter fraud. He's registered to vote at an address where he doesn't live. In Florida, I guess he wants to be a swing voter because he actually lives in California, which reliably votes Democratic. People are wondering if he's also guilty of tax evasion because if he lists his permanent residence in Florida, there's no income tax versus a 7.8% income tax in California. So when this came to light, he apparently decided, well, I've got to do something about this. And so he changed his voter registration address from the house in Florida where he absolutely doesn't live because that one's slated for demolition. He changed it to another house in Florida where he doesn't live. I don't know how that helps him, but it's
amazing.
This is the, I guess they're trying to prove the existence of voter fraud by showing that, yes, it can happen here.
Yeah, but there again, so maybe he's crooked, but he's also vehemently anti-Jewish.
Right.
I mean, his ex-wife in their divorce papers was saying that he didn't want to send his kids to the school because there were too many Jews there.
Right.
And and he's on record as saying some of these horrible things.
Yeah. And domestic violence and everything else.
Yeah.
I'm afraid, though, Jim, we're going to have to leave it here because we've filled up an hour. As usual, you and I could sit here and talk for 3 hours and not run out of things to talk about. So you've been watching All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and good night.